Coming up, Isaac Newton was a magician, fairy familiars, and did a cunning woman live in this cave home? Hi, I'm Juliet. I'm a writer and historian, and on this channel I cover myth, legend, folklore, ghost stories, witchcraft, and weird and wonderful history in general. This is episode 6 of my history of witchcraft and magic in Europe, so it's part of an ongoing series. In the previous episode we looked at witchcraft and magic in medieval Christianity and in medieval Christian contexts in Europe. We've now reached the early modern period, also known as the Renaissance. If we were in America, it would be the colonial period. We're looking at basically the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, or the 1500s, 1600s and 1700s if, like me, you still can't quite wrap your head around which century is which. And I'm splitting the early modern period into 2 episodes. So, the early modern period is the period when the infamous European witch trials took place, or most of them. There were witch trials in the medieval period, in the Roman period. We covered that in our episode on Rome. There are witch trials a little bit later in some places. It's not the only period where there are witch trials, but the spate of witch trials that has sometimes been called the witch craze happened in the early modern period in Europe. Obviously, I'm not talking about Salem, which is the same period, but in America. So I will, at some point, do a video about Salem, but that video is not today. The witch trials are an incredibly important and fascinating subject, and they are usually how people come to early modern witchcraft and its history. Most people kind of start with the witch trials and go from there, and that's reflected in the scholarship. When you're looking for kind of books and articles on early modern witchcraft and magic, the vast majority of them will kind of start with the trials, and then they'll explore witchcraft and magic more broadly from there. Not all, and of course you can check out the list in the description of my sources where you'll see plenty of books that don't do that. But it is a bit of an overwhelming tendency. The history of witchcraft and magic in this period is completely overshadowed by the trials. Now, the trials are important and fascinating, and I am going to give them their own episode in the next episode in this series. So I put out new episodes every 4 weeks. Episode 7 in 4 weeks' time will be on the early modern European witch trials. But before we get into the trials themselves, I really wanted to do an episode focusing on the history of magical practices in this period, because the history of witchcraft and magic in any period is not just the history of legal persecutions and trials, even though that is often a part of it. Certainly throughout European history, from the Romans onwards, legality and trials and so on up until witchcraft acts were eventually got rid of in the 20th century is a part of the history of witchcraft and magic in Europe. But it's only a part of it, it's not the whole story. And there's lots of magical practices and various magical practitioners living and working in Europe throughout this period. So in this episode, we will mention the trials at various points, particularly because they provide evidence for a lot of it, but we are not going to focus on the trials. We are going to look at the history of witchcraft and magic in Europe more broadly, and then we will come back and focus on the trials in the next episode. Much of the actual practice of witchcraft and magic in the early modern period is a continuation of practices from the later medieval period, which we looked at in the last episode. We have a similar, not a division, a spectrum between learned magic and folk magic, which is equally learned. Honestly, these academic terms are useless, really. Between book magic, between the magic of education and learning, and the magic of oral cultures. And there's a spectrum between the two. As in the late medieval period, although the witch trials are predominantly attacks on women, 80% of the victims in the witch trials were women. So 1 in 5 were men, but that means 4 out of 5 were women. When it comes to magical practices, the gender division is still similar to the medieval period, and it is still, these practices can be carried out by anyone of any gender. The more kind of book learned the type of magic you're doing, the more likely you are to be male, for the simple reason that you are more likely to be literate. Now, there were lots of women who could read and write in the medieval and early modern periods, but if you are poor, you are less likely to be literate. And then if you are female, you are less likely again. Basically, a poor woman is the most likely to be illiterate, to be using oral cultures and oral traditions rather than written. And there's this spectrum of magical practices that are passed down, on the one extreme entirely orally, and on the other extreme entirely through kind of book learning. So inevitably you have more men on the book learning end, and you have possibly slightly more women. We'll come back to that on the oral end. That came out unintentionally. Not how I meant that phrase. Universities, as we know them, had been founded in the medieval period. The earliest universities in Europe are the University of Bologna, founded in 1088, which gives the institution its name, the University of Paris, founded in 1150, and the University of Oxford, founded in 1167. So by the time we get to the 16th century, or the 1500s, we have quite a few universities throughout Europe, and they are restricted to men. So inevitably, as the very learned forms of magic become associated with universities and university study, they then become exclusive to men, because women, even if they can read and write, which many well-off women could, did not have access to university education. So as we come into the early modern period, magicians, astrologers, alchemists, they usually tend to be connected to universities and have degree level learning, and so therefore they are male. One of the most famous was John Dee, who lived 1527 to 1608 or 9. He worked in royal courts, first in England and then in continental Europe. He used astrology to select the date of Queen Elizabeth I's coronation, which was the 15th of January 1559. He had a degree from Cambridge, and he was a founding fellow of Trinity College in Cambridge when Henry VIII founded it. He was a philosopher. His philosophy was kind of rooted in Neoplatonism and in Jewish Kabbalah teaching. He was Catholic originally. When he was born in 1527, the Church of England did not exist. The Reformation had started in Europe, but Henry VIII had not yet broken away from the Catholic Church when he was born, so he was Catholic. But he converted to Protestant, Church of England, on the accession of Elizabeth I. He practiced kind of every learned form of magic around at the time. He practiced astrology, alchemy, talking to angels, scrying. The British Museum has 5 objects said to have belonged to him. A crystal ball. You can also see him in this image with his crystal ball. Wax seals engraved with mathematical and magical devices. An obsidian mirror of Aztec origin. A gold amulet. And a tablet engraved with a scene from a vision communicated by angels to his associate Edward Kelly. And you can see how all of this is a continuation of the practices that developed through the later medieval period. Astronomy, of course, goes back to ancient Persia, as does the word magic, via the Romans. Alchemy has really developed through the medieval period. Talking to angels was something of a medieval obsession. And then we've got other practices with very deep roots. Crystal balls may go back to Celtic practices. Wax seals, amulets. The use of amulets goes back as far as we have evidence for magic, pretty much. And we've talked about all of these things in previous episodes of this series. Edward Kelly, who had had this vision of angels, was John Dee's chief scryer. His ears had been cut off as a punishment for forgery. Interesting. Anyway, Dee and Kelly were trying to reproduce the apocryphal Book of Enoch, this hypothetical book written in the language of God, assuming God has some kind of human language. Kelly also claimed to have communed with many spirits through crystal balls and the Aztec mirror, including the Archangel Michael, as well as lesser angels or spirits such as Uriel and Anael. Kelly was then given a position in Prague over Dee because he had apparently created gold using earth brought from Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset. Glastonbury and Glastonbury Tor often associated with King Arthur, which may or may not be why this earth was supposed to be particularly magical. So Kelly did quite well for himself. Dee, unfortunately, was accused of spying for the English court and ended up dying in poverty in London, where he ended up back in London toward the end of his life. Dee just did not seem to be very good at the game of politics. Kelly was better at it. Another very famous figure not usually thought of as a magician is Isaac Newton. Now, of course, we all know Isaac Newton as the guy who had an apple fall on his head and he went, "Ooh, gravity!" And Isaac Newton was a scientist, and many modern scientific theories are rooted in his work, and without him, we would not have many modern things. Look at me talking about science as if I know what I'm on about. He was educated in Trinity College, Cambridge, and he was later a fellow of the same college, Trinity. No, of course, that was John Dee's college that he was a fellow of. But Newton, in addition to physics, was interested in astronomy and especially in alchemy. Like Dee and many others, he was searching for the philosopher's stone. This was thought to be the key to the unity underlying the universe. We can see here his sketch of the qualities of the philosopher's stone, and I've taken this from Chris Gosden's book, The History of Magic. I love the little labels, one of them saying like, this is black, this is green. If anybody has discovered the philosopher's stone, let me know in the comments. Why are parts of it black and parts of it green? Newton was attempting to come up with a theory of everything. This combined his expertise in physics and his interest in alchemy. So whereas from a modern perspective, we look at it and we go, Newton, this famous physicist and scientist, also was into alchemy and magic because we think they're different things. From Newton's perspective, people had not yet become obsessed with the idea that magic, religion and science are three separate things. We've seen that magic and religion were often opposed to each other. It's very common to see magic defined against religion, magic as not proper religion, magic as an insult to religion, and so on and so forth. That's very common. But the whole idea of science as a separate sphere hadn't really been developed. You know, it is developed through the Enlightenment that Newton is at the beginning of. In the ancient world and into the medieval and early modern world, philosophy, the love of wisdom, is the love of all wisdom. It isn't a specific type of wisdom, and it isn't reliant on a scientific method or on testing hypotheses. Scientists would do experiments, and in fact we can see here in this image John Dee performing an experiment. Early modern scientists would absolutely be doing experiments, and it's in the early modern period that we see science separate itself off and develop the scientific method as we come into the Enlightenment. But Newton is still fairly early, relatively speaking, and he would still have had a more ancient idea of philosophy as love of wisdom in general. Whether that wisdom is to be found through scientific testing and scientific method, or through alchemy or astrology or whatever else. He was later described by economist John Maynard Keynes in the 20th century as the last of the magicians rather than the first of the scientists. And he does exist in that border as the Enlightenment is beginning and this idea of separating off science and creating a scientific method is beginning. Newton is kind of right in that border between philosophy and magic as an acceptable part of philosophy, or acceptable depending on circumstance, and then the switch to kind of science. Astrology continued to be extremely popular in this period, and we have a fantastic set of records of astrological consultations from the period of the late 1500s, early 1600s. These come from England, and we have records of over 80,000 astrological consultations, mainly from two practitioners. Simon Forman, who lived 1552 to 1611, who lived in London, and Richard Napier, who lived 1559 to 1634, who was a priest from Buckinghamshire. Forman taught Napier, and then Napier left his and Forman's papers to his nephew, Sir Richard Napier, who lived 1607 to 76, who also practiced astrology, and then he added the records of his own consultations, so there's at least 3 different astrologers represented here, and that takes the history of their joint work up to the 1660s, and this collection eventually ended up in the hands of Elias Ashmole, who founded the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. They were very well known and very popular. Shakespeare's landlady once visited Forman. About 90% of the questions they're asked relate to illness and health, and then the other 10% cover marriage, career prospects, missing persons, witchcraft, legal suits, and so on. So all the same sorts of things that people would go to an oracle for in the ancient world, or that people might read their horoscope for, or that they would go to a cunning person for. They could also go and consult with the astrologers over these questions. Forman and Napier practiced various forms of astrology. They often did horary consultations, which is checking the positions of the planets and stars when the question was asked. Sometimes they would do a nativity, which is charting the stars at the moment of the customer's birth. It's probably the better known one these days. Sometimes blood samples were taken, and in about 25% of the cases, the patient's urine is described. So how that helped astrologically, I don't know, but it was apparently felt necessary, at least 25% of the time. They also used astrological charts and sometimes other forms of divination like dice throwing. These go all the way back to ancient Rome. I can't remember if I talked about them in the episode on Roman magic, because in a Roman context they're kind of divination / superstition rather than magic. Whereas by the time we've got to the early modern period, anything that does not involve prayer is kind of associated with magic, although again we could say, oh, is that really magic? Is just superstition? The lines are very blurry. In over 1,000 cases, angels and archangels were questioned. So again, the summoning or talking to angels as a method for solving problems was still very popular as well. Napier also prescribed amulets, and although he was Protestant, he sometimes carried out exorcisms. And Napier was a rector, a vicar, a Protestant priest, a priest of the Church of England. And the church doesn't ever seem to have had a problem with all this. It may be that astrology is more acceptable in a Christian context because the magi who visit the baby Jesus are Persian priests / magicians, that's where the word comes from, magos, via the Latin. So it's possible that astrology was considered more acceptable than other forms of magic. There's certainly, like, they're talking to angels, there's no suggestion of devils, although if you were unfortunate enough to be accused of witchcraft, then they could accuse you of thinking you were talking to one and actually talking to the other. But Napier never seems to have got in trouble with the church for either the exorcisms, which we think of now as rather Catholic, or the astrology, or the dice throwing, or the urine checking. And it's another reminder that, as we saw in the later medieval period, while the official position of the Christian church, of the various Christian churches by this point, we have Protestants now, while the official position of various Christian churches was always that magic is wrong and only prayer is okay. In practice, there are all sorts of magical practices carried out by devout Christians in a Christian context. Many Christians would carry out magical practices and not see any issue with that conflicting with their Christianity, especially if they're talking to angels, you know. We might say, well, if you're doing a summoning spell and you expect it to work and it's not a request, that's magic rather than prayer. But they might say, well, I'm trying to get hold of an angel, you know, what's unchristian about that? Forman did occasionally rile people up the wrong way, but he was not prosecuted. He actually correctly predicted the day of his own death, spookily enough. He died in the Thames, presumably drowning. Another common aspect of magical practice that's continued over from the medieval period is what I like to call defence against the dark arts. Along with the belief that there are malevolent witches carrying out acts of maleficium, malevolent magic, and doing deals with the devil and all sorts, comes the desire to protect yourself against that. And protections against magic, again, go back way before Christianity. The ancient Greeks and Romans had magical amulets and spells to protect them from somebody else using magic against them, or from a witch cursing them or something. And that continues, and it also gets wrapped up with protection from demons and devils. Once the kind of Christian belief system involving a devil and hell and demons sort of grows and solidifies through the medieval period, people then want protection from devils and demons. And sometimes they tried to do that using magical practices. And we've seen this already in the medieval period. And they could go to specialists for this. You could go to Cunning-folk and ask them to make you an amulet or something. You could go to a witch finder. That's something we'll talk about more when we talk about the trials in the next episode. But you could also do it yourself. So in episode 5, we saw some examples of witch marks in churches. That's these bits of graffiti, and because they scratched it into the walls, you can still see it, in various designs that are designed to ward off demons, partly because it's thought that if you've got a design that's a continuous line, the demon will keep trying to follow the line to the end and it'll never get to the end and it'll sort of trap the demon. The one we looked at in that episode was a pentangle. There's also other designs including daisy wheels, 2 overlapping V's, sometimes inverted to make an M, like the one you can see here. Also merrills, which are squares or rectangles with lines crossing in the middle. Swastikas, this is obviously not the Nazi symbol, but the older symbol that has its roots in the Roman period and is meant to ward off evil. or knot designs. From the 15th century onwards, people start building their homes in wood, stone or brick instead of wattle and daub being kind of mud. And then they started to shift these protection marks from the churches to their houses, especially around doors, windows and chimneys. The idea is to stop a witch or a demon or an evil spirit getting in, so you block up all the possible entrances, including the chimney. They would also sometimes put them in dark spaces and on major pieces of furniture, interestingly enough. And they might put them in barns and storage areas as well to protect their goods. And so there we find all the same sorts of protection marks that we saw in the later medieval period in the churches. The other major method of protection was hiding or burying material objects in various parts of the house. For example, one possibility was to use hagstones. These are stones with a naturally occurring hole in them. So they're fairly rare. Like a four-leaf clover, they're considered to have these magical properties because they're rare. And these hagstones could be put on the hearth, by the chimney, or by doors to keep witches out. Another thing that people often used is something scholars call spiritual middens. These are collections of objects regularly deposited in a chimney or wall for years. So rather than a single object that is put there and then that's done, a spiritual midden, you collect a whole bunch of objects of various significance over a long period of time in one spot. In 16th century Europe, it was common to build a lath and plaster framework around a brick chimney, leaving this kind of void of space between the two, and you would often put these spiritual middens in that space. For example, at Barley House Farm in Suffolk, in the space next to a chimney, were found 20 shoes, all extremely well used and deposited at some point between the 1650s and 1730. As well as split-notched sticks and animal remains, including pig's trotters, a vertebra of something, a goose wing, 2 kittens and a rat as a group. So all of those poor old cats in walls that then go and haunt places. I vividly remember a French chateau we went to once where they found a cat in the wall that was supposedly haunting the chateau. Some of those animals may have been put there deliberately, I hope after they died. But they may have been put there on purpose as a form of magical protection. Bottles and jars were also used for this kind of purpose. Bellarmine or Bartman bottles were made in Germany, and then from Germany, as the early modern period went on, they got exported to other places as well. And these are bottles with images of angry bearded faces on them. As in this example, this is a sherd from the neck of a Bellarmine bottle. But there were other types of bottles and witch jars, as they became known as well. An English doctor called Joseph Blagrave wrote a book called Astrological Practice of Physic in 1671, in which he advised anybody who thinks they are bewitched to put urine, hair and nail clippings into a bottle and then add nails, thorns and pins. These should cause stabbing pains to the witch, who might reveal themselves and cease their bewitchments. I'm assuming, you'd want the urine and the hair and the nail clippings of the witch if you want the nails to stab her, but then how would you get the witch's urine? So I suppose it's your own urine, hair and nail clippings? I don't know if you have to do something to tell the bottle that it's the witch you want stabbed, not yourself. Anyway, Blagrave adds that these bottles could be buried in a garden or hidden within a house for more protection. This was a very long-running tradition. The Pitt Rivers Museum has a witch jar, which is unusual because it's meant to have actually trapped the witch in it. What Blagrave is describing is more something that protects you from the witch. If you didn't want to do it yourself, then as in the medieval period, you could consult a cunning person. Cunning folk, cunning man, cunning woman, the word comes from English people, but the term is quite often used when speaking about these magical practitioners across Europe, if we are using the English language. Now, of course, each individual part of Europe has its own specific term, and there are slight differences in the practices in between the various places, but when scholars are writing in the English language or we're speaking in the English language, we've started to kind of use cunning folk for all of them, unless there is a specific reason that we need to use a different word, just for the sake of easiness. And again, these practices are really just continuing from the later medieval period. There really isn't much change necessarily as we move into the early modern period in these practices. We do get a little bit more information, in some cases simply from the fact that they are vulnerable to being prosecuted for witchcraft. That didn't actually happen all that often in most places. Little bit more often in some places than others. So Norway and Hungary may have had slightly more prosecutions of actual cunning folk. And Hungary has a couple of different types of magical practitioner as well who wouldn't necessarily come under that heading, who also could sometimes be prosecuted. Generally speaking, considering the numbers of cunning folk that appear to have been around, and the numbers of them, you know, the proportion of witch trials that involve people who seem to have actually been cunning folk, it's a very small proportion who are actually prosecuted. But they are, of course, vulnerable to it, because that official position of both the churches and then, in the early modern period, of the secular laws, is that all magic is outlawed, so they're always vulnerable to prosecution. Scholars tend to differentiate between a cunning person who works beneficial folk magic and a witch who works harmful magic or who doesn't work magic at all but is accused of doing so. Basically every scholar, every historian has their own slightly different way of using those terms. That is the broad division of kind of splitting off the idea of the witch and also the idea of the witch as malevolent against the cunning person who performs a function in their community. In most cases, the actual laws didn't make a distinction, and probably the distinction in the minds of people would have been, they would have made a very clear distinction between malevolent and beneficent magic. Is somebody helping me or hurting me? But whether they thought of a cunning person and a witch as significantly different, it may have depended on whether they thought of witches as being specifically aligned with the devil. But again, cunning people could be accused of that, even if it's not what they were doing. So really it's a very fine line. There was one Danish ordinance from 1617 that did specify that cunning folk should be fined and exiled, whereas witches should be burned. Apologies, I got that piece of information from an English language book, I think it was from Owen Davies, and he didn't provide the Danish. So normally I would always quote the Danish, and especially for specific terms like that, but he didn't provide the Danish. So if anybody knows the Danish primary source that comes from and the Danish terms that would have been used, please let me know. So we can draw lines between cunning folk and witches, but those lines will be very fuzzy. In some places, for example in 18th century France, healers were particularly persecuted, partly to protect the medical profession. And here again, we see that gender split and that split in education, where if you are an educated doctor who has studied medicine, then you are male and you've probably been to university. And in this period, you might be using all sorts of medical practices we wouldn't use now, leeches most famously, but there is increasingly a medical profession of qualified, educated doctors, and they're protecting the interests of those. The village healers could be any gender, but the midwives are mostly women. And there's a certain amount of overlap between midwifery and cunning folk, and it's not absolute. Not all cunning folk were midwives, especially the men. Midwifery in the early modern period, as going all the way back through European history, is generally something practiced by women and passed down orally by women. In fact, this division goes all the way back to ancient Rome, where you've got educated Greek doctors who write things down, and you've got female midwives of whatever origin who do not write things down. Extremely highly educated orally, because you have to be a midwife, but not literate, not writing it down. So where there is an overlap, and there was in some cases an overlap where a cunning person, given that one of their specialties could be healing, if you are a cunning woman, then quite often one of your specialisms will be midwifery. It doesn't have to be, but they would go together quite frequently. So it's possible that you've got a slightly larger proportion, especially of kind of folk healers, healers working with orally transmitted training. Those people are going to be possibly slightly more women than men, and the educated doctors are definitely men. They have to be. In other places, religious institutions took particularly against cunning folk. As we've seen, that's not universal, but sometimes a religious institution would kind of decide it was going to prosecute some witches and cunning folk would be included. Not specific to Catholic or Protestant. Something we'll look at in more detail in the next episode on the witch trials, but witch trials happened in both Catholic areas and Protestant areas. They are not specific to either branch of Christianity. Eva Poisch not sure if I'm pronouncing her name properly, sorry, has summed up the most important roles of cunning folk in Central and Western Europe as healing, fortune-telling, finding lost objects or animals, exposing thieves, seeing, finding buried treasure or money, and communicating messages from the dead. So not quite the Victorian seance, but, you know, its antecedents. In mountainous regions, weather magic could also be important, so getting rain or warding off hail, that kind of thing. Owen Davis has actually suggested that slightly more cunning folk may have been men, but again, that depends how much of an overlap is there with midwifery and how much of that is down to higher rates of literacy among men. So there are plenty of literate women in the early modern period, but the number, you know, there's more literate men. Or rather, I guess, a higher proportion of people who are not literate are women. And women often have, going back to at least ancient Rome, strong traditions of passing things down orally because not all of them can read and write. And midwifery in particular, and women's magic more generally. It's quite possible that there isn't so much evidence because they're passing down these traditions orally more often than in writing. Having said that, a lot of the evidence comes from the trials, which are of course 80% women. That's also a bit of a problem for trying to work out what the actual practices were, because when it comes to the details of how they worked their magic, the evidence could be quite misleading from trials. Where we've got material culture, we're a little bit on firmer ground where we've got witch marks to look at and bottles to look at. Descriptions from trials of what they did with their magic, probably reasonably accurate. So they're using it for healing, to find things, to catch a thief. This kind of detail often comes up when they do get put on trial, partly because sometimes one of the reasons for being put on trial is because it hasn't worked. If they're known for healing, but then one of their patients dies, then they become very vulnerable to being accused of witchcraft, and they cursed the victim, the person who died, instead of healing them, stuff like that. We've already seen in the medieval period examples where people were put on trial for witchcraft because they had identified someone as a thief, and the person they identified said, I am not a thief and you can't convict me on the basis of witchcraft, thank you very much. And then the cunning person gets put on trial for witchcraft. So that sort of thing is quite reliable in terms of what are they doing, because the whole trial has come about because of what they've been doing. How they did it is a little bit trickier to determine from trial evidence. Whether there was anything specifically notable about a cunning person's home, we don't really know. They might have used it as a way to advertise their business. There is one example in South Staffordshire that may be a cunning person's home, and that would stand out a bit from the crowd. This is Nanny's Rock in Kinver in South Staffordshire, or just outside the village of Kinver more accurately. This is one of several cave homes in the area. So there's quite a few. The National Trust maintain and have redone, refurbished a few homes over the other side of Kinver Edge. Dog's about to jump off the cliff, daft animal. Anyway, this particular home is known as Nanny's Rock, and it was the home of a woman called Margaret of the Foxearth, who died in 1617 and who is recorded in the Kinver parish records of St. Peter's Church. It's quite spacious, it's got 5 rooms, so this is a nice home. People weren't living in these cave homes because they were poor, they weren't rich, but they were living in these cave homes because the sandstone is very soft. Here you can see it's very, very easy to just scratch at this sandstone. All of the caves on Kinver Edge are covered in graffiti. It goes back, sorry, I'm waving dog poo bags around on the video, sorry about that. The graffiti goes back centuries and right up to the present day. I have been up on the rock houses and seen kids scratching away at the sandstone. It's very, very soft. So it's easy to carve out a home from natural caves or even just out of the rock. And as with any cave home, it has advantages of being easy to heat up in the winter and easy to keep cool in the summer. It's quite a nice sunny July day today. It's actually fairly warm, so it's actually really nice to be in this nice cool cave out of the hot sunshine. So the National Trust's website says, oh, who was the woman who lived here? How did it get the name Nanny's Rock? Was she a white witch or a herbalist or something? Local legend generally has it that she was some kind of white witch or cunning woman, or possibly a Christian hermit. Now, any of those is possible. Absolutely not impossible that any of those things is true. How likely it is is a little bit harder to say. This idea seems a lot more related to what we think a witch or a cunning person should be than what they really were. Cunning people could be men as well as women. It's not a gender-specific role unless it's combined with midwifery, which some did, some didn't. We also have this idea of a witch or a cunning woman as an old woman living alone outside of a town or village, socially isolated, vulnerable to charges of witchcraft because she's socially isolated, and so on. Now, a lot of that may play into victims of the witch trials, but actual practitioners of magic could just as easily live in a town. Many of them were married. We have lots of records of cunning women who were married. They lived near to people. They needed to be near to people. That's their customer base. So actually, if you make your living as a cunning person, being isolated out in the countryside actually wouldn't be a very good idea. The name also kind of suggests witchiness, Margaret of the Foxearth. But Foxearth just means a foxhole, and it's also the name of a village between Essex and Sussex. So she might just have moved from a village called Foxearth, hence she's Margaret of Foxearth. It doesn't necessarily mean she's a witch. Honestly, Christian hermit kind of seems a little bit more likely because Christian hermits deliberately remove themselves from society and isolate themselves. Having said that, it is quite a large and reasonably fancy home. It looks like an abandoned cave full of graffiti now, but it was a nice home. This is pretty big. This would have been a really lovely home. You can see from the reconstructions that the National Trust have done over at the cluster of rock houses that's nearer the village that, you know, these were lovely, warm and comfortable homes. So maybe not a Christian hermit, maybe it's a little big for a Christian hermit. So she may well have been a cunning woman. There's nothing to say she wasn't a cunning woman. And the fact that it's called Nanny's Rock suggests that there was a woman, whether it was Margaret of the Foxearth or a different woman, but a woman known as Nanny who was well known enough to give her name to this rock lived here. And being a cunning woman is one way that you might make a name for yourself. So it may be the home of a cunning person. We will unfortunately never know for sure. Either way, it is a fascinating and beautiful historic dwelling, whoever lived here. One of the things that the evidence from trials suggests is that cunning folk may have used familiars. The idea of the witch's familiar is probably, I was going to say familiar, is fairly well known. Nowadays, the stereotype of the witch's familiar is probably a black cat, but in the folklore and oral traditions and indeed trial records of the early modern period, witches' familiars could take all sorts of different forms. A witch's familiar is a spirit who helps the witch or cunning person or magic practitioner with their magic. In England, familiars often took the forms of animals, not just cats, a wide variety of animals. In Scotland, it was often the devil in the form of a man, at least according to the trial records the evidence comes from. For example, in 1646, Jane Wallis, on trial in Huntingdonshire, claimed that a man in black clothes appeared in her bedroom and told her he would send to her Gristle and Greedygut. Greedygut is just the most brilliant name. And they would do anything for her. And 3 or 4 days later, they came to her in the shape of dogs with hog's hair on their backs, and did indeed promise to do anything for her. So that's dogs, but unusual dogs. That's another theme we see sometimes in English records, that it's an animal, but an animal that's unusual in some way. Across Britain, and especially in Scotland, the witch's familiar might be a fairy. Now, I'm using that word to mean the otherworldly creatures that go by a wide variety of names in British folklore. We have, of course, got several languages across the British Isles. We've got Scots Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, Welsh and Cornish, the Celtic languages. We've got English, the Germanic language. We've got Scots, and we've got all these various regional dialects. So there are an awful lot of different words for these beings, and there will be differences in beliefs about them across, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, which is part of the British Isles, not part of the same country at this point, Cornwall. There's all different collections of beliefs. So for the purposes of brevity, I'm just using the word fairy to mean, fairy, fae, elf, those creatures. Obviously, we're talking more the kind of otherworldly kings and queens type fairy, not the Tinkerbell Gossamer Wings type fairy. In 1576, Bessie Dunlop was tried in Edinburgh on charges of using sorcery, witchcraft and incantation with invocation of spirits of the devil, continuing in familiarity with them, dealing with charms and abusing the people with the devilish craft of sorcery foresaid by the means after specified. and she used these for many years. Bessie confessed that when people came to her to ask her to heal people or find stolen items, and she specifically said she had no kind of art nor science for to do. So she is very specifically saying she's not learned. She's not a learned magician, she's not working from books, she's not learned magical techniques. She's saying that her magic is coming from this familiar. And she says whenever people would come to her to ask for these things, she would ask Tom Reed, and he would tell her. Reed was the ghost of a man who had died at the Battle of Pinkie. That was a 1547 battle where the Scots lost to the English and therefore had happened several years before the trial. Tom Reed had spent time with a group of good wights, good neighbours, fairies. And they came from the court of Elfame, Elfhome, the other world, fairyland. And that he'd been sent to her by his mistress, the Queen of Elfame. He helped and advised her on everything, interestingly including midwifery. She mentions midwifery as one of the things she did as a healer, and she specifically says that Tom Reed, this male ghost, was telling her what to do and was helping her with the midwifery. It's a very interesting thing to claim. Generally speaking, a midwife would be taught their craft by another midwife, and that's probably what happened. One of the problems with using the evidence from trials is these confessions are obtained under torture, and torture is not a reliable form of evidence. What Bessie is describing is very much kind of in the spirit of Scottish folklore. There's lots of folklore about the other world and elves, fairies, whatever name you're using for them. Seelie wights is a common one in Scotland. She's claiming that she's getting it from this male ghost familiar who's associated with fairies, but presumably that's not where she has actually learned the art of midwifery. She just doesn't think of it as an art. Bessie was clearly actually a cunning woman. She was known to have treated many locals. Whether she actually had a fairy familiar, though, is a little bit more debatable. Is this just something she's made up under torture from folklore to try and get the torture to stop? Or was it actually part of her practice as a cunning woman? And this is what I was saying earlier about, like, looking at these trials can tell us what cunning people did. She was a healer and she helped people find stolen things, and that everybody knew that was her job. But how they did it is a bit more complicated. The result of Bessie's trial was convict and burnt. She was probably strangled and her body burnt to ashes. I mentioned that although we tend to use the English term cunning-folk for a lot of different practitioners across Europe, there are some who are distinct, not quite doing the same thing as the practitioners we tend to call cunning-folk in English. Another word that's often used by scholars to try and differentiate different types of magic practitioner is shaman. Now, technically, a shaman is a Tungus medicine man from Siberia. So it does have a specific origin and a very specific role in that context in Asia, in Siberia. But the word shaman is used by anthropologists for religious practitioners of any gender who use supernatural power and who usually use less ritualized and more individual practices than priests. Owen Davis suggests a shaman is any magical healer who achieves an altered state of consciousness by means of drugs, drums, dance, or chant, and who, once in this state, mediates between their clients and the other world of spirits and gods. So in this sense, it's not attached to any specific religion. Obviously, the original shamans, the Tunguskan shamans, were attached to specific religious practices. But the way the word is used by anthropologists now is not attached to any one specific religion. It could be attached to any religion. It's more to do with the methods and the way that people are communicating with the spirit world in whatever belief system they're in. And that can include Christianity. If you have a Christian who is using drugs, drums, dance, or chant to mediate between clients and the other world, whether that's angels or whatever, that would be shamanistic at the very least, if you don't want to call it actual shamans. One example of a magical practitioner from early modern Europe who seems to fall under this heading is the Hungarian Taltos. I apologise, I do not know how to pronounce Hungarian. The Taltos is a characteristically Hungarian type of magician that some scholars think was a descendant of the pre-Christian Hungarian shaman, and that may even have had links with actual Tunguskan shamans if you go far back enough in history. They were marked out at birth by being born with a caul. That is where you are born still in the amniotic sac. This is something that happens and is quite survivable, but obviously looks quite dramatic. Born with an extra finger or born with teeth. Another thing that happens occasionally, but because it's quite unusual, tends to be noticeable. And you can see here a bit of a difference between these Hungarian shamans and Cunning-folk, other forms of magic and witchcraft, where you can learn to be a magician or an alchemist or a cunning person. Maybe if you're a cunning person, you might connect with a familiar and do it that way. But these particular shamans, the Taltasok, are born as Taltasok, as shamans. In terms of their practices, they had much the same range as cunning-folk, although curing bewitchment, so curing people who have been bewitched by malevolent magic, and finding treasure were kind of their absolute specialities, but they would do all the same kinds of things as other cunning-folk. And like cunning-folk, they were also vulnerable to prosecution for witchcraft. There are at least 26 records of trials of Taltasok. For example, Urza Toth, who was tried in 1728, she had 3 double teeth at birth, and her soul apparently travelled regularly to the other world where she met the Virgin Mary and Jesus gave her medicine, and she also had a helping spirit in the form of a dragon. And you can see there she's Christian, she's meeting with the Virgin Mary and Jesus. This is not incompatible with Christianity, or at least the church would say it is. She was put on trial for witchcraft, so yes, officially it's incompatible with Christianity, but on the ground level, where people are actually living their lives and have their own sets of beliefs and practices, she did not consider herself to be in any way unchristian. She was meeting with Jesus, literally. Some Taltasok would say that at certain times their souls would join others, often in animal form, to engage in a spirit battle against evil forces to protect their community. And that is a little bit similar to an Italian group called the Benandanti, who we'll get to in a minute. We also have evidence for shamanistic magicians in the far north of Europe. The Sami had had shamanistic magicians, magical practitioners. That was part of their indigenous culture going way, way back. These are the indigenous peoples of the very northern part of Europe. By the early modern period, these practices are maybe declining a bit, but their reputation for having a lot of magicians remained, and those tend to be more male than female in that particular context. So we've seen that quite a few of these different types of magical practitioner could be vulnerable to prosecution for witchcraft. But is there any evidence for the type of witchcraft that came up most often in the trials? So we're going to talk about this in more detail in the next episode, but basically the demonology and the trials for witchcraft built up this idea of witches and what witches were and what witchcraft was, which involved things like flying to a sabbath, a meeting, possibly on a broomstick, covens of witches meeting at these witches' sabbaths, making deals with the devil, all of this very lurid stuff, some of it definitely not suitable for work stuff. These are all components of the accusations in many of the witchcraft trials and of the ideas of demonologists. So we'll go into all of it in more detail in the next episode, but is there any evidence for real life practices that in any way line up with the stuff people were being accused of doing in the witchcraft trials, other than obviously the more simple cursing people, because yes, there are always curses. They exist throughout history. Some witches who described fairy, ghost, spirit, or even angel familiars would be told by interrogators that they were actually demons or devils. So that's one way that the trials would be saying one thing, the practitioners would be saying another, but they're talking about the same thing. So a practitioner might say, I've been working with this familiar who is a fairy or even an angel, and the interrogator will say that's a demon in disguise or the devil in disguise. So in the witch trial, it's a devil, but the person hasn't actually tried to make a pact with a demon or a devil. Possibly with a fairy or an angel, but not a demon or a devil. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, some people, in fact quite a lot of people, did confess. The problem is they were all being tortured. And I'm going to link below to some information from the UN about how unreliable evidence gained under torture is. Not something I am a specific expert in myself, but there is plenty of research available to demonstrate that torture does not produce reliable information. So things that accused witches say under torture unfortunately cannot really reliably tell us about what they're actually doing. It tells us what they thought the torturers wanted to hear, because they're just trying to make the torture stop at that point. For example, there's a well-known case in England, the Pendle witch trials, which resulted in the deaths of 10 people, 8 women and 2 men. And then these were followed up with another bout in the same area a decade or so later, a couple decades later. And in the later Pendle witch trial, a woman called Margaret Johnson in 1634 confessed that the devil appeared to her in the similitude or proportion of a man, apparelled in a suit of black tied about with silk points, so as a well-dressed man wearing black, and that they made a pact and had sexual intercourse. So she is confessing to exactly the sort of lurid things that witches are accused of, but whether that relates to any reality or real behaviour is questionable because she's being tortured. It doesn't necessarily mean that none of it is true either. Emma Wilby and others have argued that some of the evidence from these trials and confessions relates to real visionary experiences, especially when they are trials of actual cunning-folk, so especially when the person on trial is actually a cunning person or other magical practitioner and not just somebody who's been accused by their neighbour for no reason. And it's certainly true to say that throughout human history, humans have had, I was going to say inexplicable, have had visionary experiences, which some people explain using science and some people explain with a spiritual explanation and some people both. I'm a bit of a both person myself. But what's important in this particular case is not the explanation, but the fact that the thing does happen. So what I'm talking about is things like, I've written a book on dreams, dream visions. Where's my book? Hang on. Where did I put it? Here it is. Dreams and Dreaming in the Roman Empire. Very boring cover. This is about prophetic dreams and dream reports, and dreams that seem to come true are something that have happened to people throughout history. Now, how you explain them is an entirely separate issue, but weird dreams and dreams that seem to mean something are a common human experience. I have a PhD student working with me right now who is working on near-death experiences. Again, a near-death experience, often with a very common pattern of seeing a bright light or seeing to go through a tunnel or floating above your body. These are reported all over the world in different contexts. So people explain them in different ways, but the experience, that feeling of floating above your body at a point where you are in kind of mortal danger, health-wise, that is an experience that people have, whichever way you explain it. Things like the third man factor or sensed presence, where people in extreme circumstances feel like there's somebody just behind them or with them or walking with them or talking to them. Some people explain it in terms of brain chemistry when under extreme stress. Some people explain it as something more spiritual, a guardian angel or the ghost of a loved one helping you out, but the experience is the same, whatever the explanation. Another one that we tend to use the scientific explanation as a label for is sleep paralysis. The feeling that you can't move and that there is something dark coming at you, you can't breathe properly, the feeling there's something sitting on your chest. People have explained that as demons, aliens, fairies, ghosts, poltergeists, and now sleep paralysis. A weird thing that happens in sleep. I do not remember the exact science of it, but same point is the same, which is the experience no matter how we explain it. So with all that in mind, it's very possible that some of the things people report in their confessions were real experiences that they had, visionary experiences, dreams, hallucinations, whatever, however you want to explain them. The experience may have been real. The problem, of course, is that information being extracted under torture, which means we can never really be sure. There is one group who have sometimes been identified as a possible witch cult, or possibly as the source of the stories about witches' covens and the witches' sabbath. These are the benandanti from Italy. They were studied by Carlo Ginzburg in a study in the 1960s where he suggested that these might be the origin of the witches' sabbath as an idea. The benandanti were a cult, basically, in Friuli in northeastern Italy. This is an area right to the northeast of Italy where languages spoken include Italian, Friulian, Slovene and German. So it's an area of Italy with, I was going to say its own unique culture, with quite a lot of cultures coming together, really. In 1580, a town crier called Battista Modico told an inquisitor that "I am a benandante because I go with the others to fight 4 times a year, that is during the Ember days at night. I go invisibly in spirit and the body remains behind. We go forth in the service of Christ and the witches of the devil." They're fighting the witches of the devil. They're not serving Christ and the witches at the same time. "We fight each other. We," that's the benandanti, "with bundles of fennel, and they, the witches, with sorghum stalks. And if we are the victors that year there is abundance, but if we lose, there is famine." Modico also claimed that the witches always go out on Thursdays to hurt someone, and I do not know if anyone calls them out. The witches do reverence and pray to their masters, who go about with great solemnity in black dress and with chains around their necks and who insist on being kneeled to. So Ginsberg suggests that these stories are actually the origins of the idea of the witches' sabbath, of witches flying off and meeting up to hurt people and do bad things and cause famine and whatever else. However, if we're trying to work out what people were really doing and find real practices from the early modern period, Ginsberg also clearly states in his preface to the English edition of his book that no document allows us to conclude with certainty that the benandanti actually met on set occasions to perform the rites described in their confessions. And another important point here is that Modoco only described going out in spirit, with his body remaining behind. He's quite specific that his body remains behind and he goes out in spirit. And it was clear that he only encountered the witches during the Ember Days when they fought them. He wasn't going with them on Thursdays. So we've got like second-hand rumour about what the witches do on Thursdays, or whatever that is. And then we've got the benandanti going out in spirit, so not physically meeting. So more like the Hungarian shamans who go forth in spirit, but not like the lurid witches' covens of the trials. Also, of course, again, Battista Modoco is a man, and 80% of the witches on trial are women. As Ginsberg says, may have led to some of the development of the story of the witches' sabbath, but it doesn't seem to provide evidence of them actually happening. Some British cunning-folk did claim to physically travel to meet with fairies. So we've got, in the mid-17th century, the fairy boy from Leith, who met the fairies every Thursday night under a large hill between Edinburgh and Leith. Another cunning man, John Walsh from Dorset, who was tried in 1566, met the fairies on hills between 12 noon and 1, or at midnight. A cunning man called John Stewart, who was tried in 1618, met the fairies every Saturday at 7 o'clock, and also every Halloween, again on hills. Hills, of course, associated with fairies in British folklore. But I mean, these are all men, so that might be a coincidence. I've taken these examples from Emma Wilby's book, and it might just be a coincidence of the ones she happened to pick. But these are all men, which again does not match the 80 to 20 ratio of women to men in the witch trials. It's evidence from trials, so it might not even be true because it's been extracted under torture. And they claim to be meeting with fairies, not with other witches or cunning folk. So it's not a witches' sabbath. They're meeting up with the fairies, which is really another thing altogether, and again to do with British folklore about the other world. It is of course possible that descriptions of people's souls flying out, like the benandanti, might have given rise to the idea that witches fly on broomsticks or in other ways to get to the Sabbath. But again, no evidence of that actually happening, and they're not claiming that. The benandanti are saying that, like the shamans, that their souls fly out, not that their bodies fly. Now, obviously, if we don't have material culture, reconstructing real practices from witch trials is very difficult. It's always better if we have the material culture. Trying to reconstruct real practice from evidence extracted under torture is tricky. We do it because it's the evidence we have, so we make do with what we've got, and we try and extract from it what we can. Basically, it doesn't look like the type of witchcraft that the demonologists are talking about bears really any relation at all to the type of witchcraft actually being practiced. Victims of the witch trials could fall under at least 4 different categories. You've got people caught practicing some kind of witchcraft or sorcery, whatever that may be, any of the magical practitioners we've talked about. Healers and cunning folk who lost their clients' trust, so a particular group of group 1, but specifically if something has gone wrong. They've accused somebody of being a thief, a patient has died, and that's when they get prosecuted. Third group, people who conform to a stereotype of a witch. So we saw the idea of Nanny's Rock, that cave home that's outside of the village. Oh, it must have been like a white witch or a herbalist or a cunning woman who lived here. Well, that's a stereotype. The idea that potentially an old woman or a woman, an unmarried woman living alone is a witch. It doesn't actually match a lot of the evidence for cunning folk, who could be either gender, who could be married, who would often live in towns or in villages. So a third group of victims of the witch trials could be people who conform to the stereotype of a witch, regardless of whether or not they actually do any magical practice themselves. And of course, there's all those everyday magical practices that everyone's doing. They might do those. Eva Pusch puts it as people surrounded by an aura of witch beliefs. And then there's a fourth group of people who have no connection to witchcraft whatsoever and have pissed off their neighbours and end up accused of witchcraft. Magic practitioners were definitely vulnerable. They were vulnerable because they were practicing witchcraft, which officially, according to church doctrine, was not okay. If they were a healer and the wrong person died, they accused the wrong person of theft, whatever, then they were very vulnerable. And of course they were vulnerable in the sense that if they pissed somebody off, there was an immediate, easy way to attack them. But there is a whole set of beliefs that rose up around malevolent and mostly female witches that really doesn't have a whole lot to do with real magical practices. It rose up alongside the study of demonology and then became embroiled in this infamous witch craze or witch trials of this period. So as I said earlier, these trials are complicated and sad and horrifying, and they very much deserve their own episode to look at all by themselves. So that will be our next episode. In 4 weeks' time, episode 7 will focus specifically on the early modern witch trials in Europe. It's going to be really depressing. Please watch it anyway. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like because it really helps me out. It helps other people to find the video. Share it with anybody you think might enjoy it. But in the meantime, thank you for watching and I'll see you next time. Bye! The walk over to Nanny's Rock is lovely. It is absolutely gorgeous today. Look at that. This is what I want to do for a living. I want to have beautiful countryside walks and see historic sites and keep an eye on the dog who's just run off. Freya! There she is! Good girl. Oh man, look at that. It's gorgeous. There's a lot of up and down on this route. I don't think you can really make out how steep that bit over there is from this video. You can see why people thought Nanny's Rock might have been the home of a witch or cunning woman, the way it kind of peeks out between the trees in the middle of the woods, in kind of the middle of nowhere.